Se tu la parla miezza americano, quando si fa l'amore sotto la luna, come te viene in capo di I love you.
Funny accent to American ears. Money packed in to American fears. So money tapped in to American heirs. Got the news screaming terrorists everywhere, and it's apparent various legislation is making it impossible to level up the nation's basic dilemmas. So why let us out of $5 right into your prison?
If I allow the policeman to kill a human being kneeling down, or their hands dried in surrender. But I've always told you that if you have to shoot them dead, shoot them dead, shoot them dead, shoot them dead.
Mga anak, salamat sa lahat, lalo na sa pagpapatakbo ng alamat. Kontra droga ang pamagat, kamauna pangarap ang pabalat. Para sa kaayusan, para sa kaunlaran, para sa kapayapaan. Ano nga naman ang kamatayan ng mga salot sa lago? Kayo nang bahala kung paano ang galaw. Matayog ang pangako, mababa ang tanaw. Tira lang ng tira gang walang matira. Bubusala ng lahat ng mabida. Bala ang batas, bala ang pitaka, bala ang balitang di makilala. Ito'y digma at ito ang pasinaya. Mga anak, kayo ang makinarya.
At sa pagsupil ng mga salot na lipunan, wag nang alalahanin ang kanilang karapatan. Ang aking salita ang siyang magiging armas. Ang aking salita ang siyang magiging batas. Aking mga anak, ipalaganap nyo ang utos ko. Huwag kayong matakot na malunod sa dugo. Ang aking salita ang siyang magiging armas. Sa aking salita walang makakaligtas.
I prefer to shoot them in the heart or in the head, as at the end of the process.
Mga bilin ni Tatay himayin, isalin at ipatay sa mga sasaklawin ng bawat kagawaran, komisyon at ahensya na magkaalaman ng hatian ng ebidensya. Este puwersa, gawing reso, gawing memo, gawing utos, clearing operations na hanggang maubos. Anong punto? Bulto-bulto lang ng puntos. May kita, este kota at may panustos.
Isa sa buhay, mga salitang pumapas lang. Nakatao sa mata ng publiko, makinari ng pagtukhang. Sa pagputok ng parilis, tutukusin ang mamamayan. Di nila kailangan na malaman ng dahilan, basta barbarilin nyo na lang. Adik, basta nasa listahan automatic kaya di. Isinulat ng mga nabamasid, ignorante manugani. Importante ang pulis may target, mabisang mata. Kapitbahay na binatawan na ang kanyang moralidad. Ginagamit na sila para ilaglag ang kapwa. Sila na nagtuturuan. Nagpapalakas kay tay, kaya damihan yung pumatay. Coordinate bago ma-terminate, gawin barangay ng pangkay. Droga ang kalaban pero diyakin ng baril sa tao nakatutok. Double barrel sa bawat patak ng dugo, kapalit tayo piso. Isa sa buhay, mga salitang pumapas lang. Nakatao sa mata ng publiko, makinari ng pagtukhang. Sa pagputok ng bariles, tutukusin ang mamamayan. Di nila kailangan na malaman ng dahilan, basta barbarilin mo na lang. Isa sa buhay, mga salitang pumapas lang. Nakatao sa mata ng publiko. 1992, gawin na natin. Memorandum celular, udyat ang aming paggalaw. Halugugin ang bawat sulok kahit na magtango'y lilitaw. Dali madilim, malagim, di pansin ng mga nasa listahan na sila'y papaslangin. Parte ng mga kotang patapusin, panay manupurol, bilyaran sementeryo, gamit ang matang nagmamasid. Barkado na agad ng mga ulo. Sikap ay nasabihan na wala nang pwedeng umalma. Target na palibutan na mga baril na kataasa. Sir, may posibleng saksi, mga alakad niya yung misis. Ano nga ba protocol natin? Wala naman sila sa drug watch. Huwag mo na intindihin yan, trabaho mo gawin mo na lang. Di mo ikakaasenso, saka wala silang bilang. Pinasok na bayan, ginamos na lahat ng pwedeng witness. Buka ng target ay nasa sahig, baril ang paglimitis. Umapalagpas sa tinatanggi, ang pagiging adik, taimtim na nagmakaawa.
Good day, everyone. You've just watched a music video from the music album Collateral. Collateral is an album that features tracks that are informed by real data and narratives on the Philippine drug war. The album is the product of 2 years worth of research and artistic collaboration. The data that informs the songs have been gathered from media reports and key informant interviews from communities at the front lines of the drug war. Time check is 9:10 p.m. Philippine time. Thank you for joining us today in today's webinar. Before we begin, here are some reminders and house rules for the whole duration of the webinar. To those who would like to listen in other languages, just look for the language interpretation button that you can find in the lower right portion of your Zoom screen and select the language that you want to listen to. We have interpreters for Filipino and Bahasa. If you enabled language interpretation and you only want to listen to the interpreted language, you may also click the mute original audio button. Again, for the benefit of our participants, to those who would like to listen in other languages, just look for the language interpretation button that you can find in the lower right portion of your Zoom screen and select the language that you would want to listen to. We have interpreters for Filipino and Bahasa. So if you enabled language interpretation and you only want to listen to an interpreted language, you may also click the mute original audio button. We will be having an open forum after the discussion of all the speakers. So please use the Q&A or question and answer button of Zoom to send your questions. Your questions should be clear and concise. Kindly indicate if the question is addressed to a specific speaker or to all speakers. So for those watching on Facebook, you may send in your questions by commenting on the Facebook Live video. Again, questions must be clear and concise. Also, please indicate if your question is addressed to a specific speaker or to all speakers. So for unanswered questions that we may have later due to time constraints, the General Secretariat will be compiling the questions for sending to the speakers. Your questions could also be addressed in future materials or outputs across ILPS platforms. Okay. So again, warm greetings of solidarity to everyone. My name is Nin Sapalo from the University of the Philippines. I will be speaking slowly so that our translators can catch up. So welcome to Imperialism in a Multipolar World. Where does the Philippines stand? This is the International League of People's Struggle's second webinar for the End the US Duterte Regime series. So today's webinar tackles the Philippines in a seemingly changing imperialist system. This is the second leg of a three-part webinar series, while our last webinar will be held on October 2 and will discuss the practice and prospects of the national democratic struggle. So through this series, we hope to show our participants the long-standing struggle against imperialism, semi-colonialism, and semi-feudalism in the Philippines, and how the US Duterte regime has worsened these problems while also benefiting from the current system. So, but before that, just a quick recap or summary of the previous webinar. So last September 11, ILPS Philippines Chair Elmer Labog provided us with an introduction on the semi-colonial, semi-feudal Philippine experience, while Rafael Mariano of the Kilusang Magbubukid ng Pilipinas or KMP provided us with a look into the plight of the peasant sector, and Gert Ranho Libang of Gabriela zoomed in on the women's situation in a semi-colonial and semi-feudal country. So in today's webinar, we will be locating the Philippines' economic and political situation in a moving and seemingly rebalancing imperialist system. So now I shall proceed to the introduction of our first speaker. He is the current executive director of Ibon Foundation, an independent NGO providing research, information, and education services to people's movements in the Philippines and abroad since 1978. He is also a board member of the alternative media outfit Alter Media and the civil society network Council for People's Development and Governance. He is also a fellow of the Center for People Empowerment in Governance, or CENPEG, and the Center for Anti-Imperialist Studies. He is also an editor of the online news magazine Bulatlat and has been an active educator of people's organizations as well as a resource person for schools, NGOs, government, and media since the 1990s. So let's please all welcome Jose Enrique Sunny Africa.
Thank you, Neen. Magandang gabi, araw, whatever, wherever we are. Okay, I hope this works. Uh, okay. Thank you to ILPS for the invitation. I hope I have something to share, and I'm actually really looking forward to the to the discussions afterwards. We always welcome, looking at things from different perspectives and from different points of view. I'll be taking up where, how to locate the Philippines in this, relatively new multipolar world. It's a fairly long presentation, but actually just very short structurally. I'm going to start with some context and some key features of the relatively new multipolar world, especially with how the US and China have adopted different postures on economic matters. That, of course, has relevant to countries like the Philippines, how we navigate this new multipolar era. Second part is specifically the Philippines under the Duterte administration and how it's behaved in this multipolar context. So some big picture stuff in a stylized way, just to get make sure we're on the same page regarding multipolarity. Draw out some implications in terms of economic policies, especially with the two big powers right now, the US and China, and then try to see how the last 5-6 years of the Duterte administration has tried to navigate this new world we're in, new or not so new world we're in. I'm going to start with, I don't know if many of you have seen this. It looks like a slice of rock geology. This chart shows the respective shares of global gross domestic product, essentially how big the different countries are as a share of the world economy. Every color is obviously it's one particular country. So I think that it's important to start off with this because this is really the economic basis of the multipolarity we're facing today. Not everything develops the same, not everything is static. So uneven development over the last, in particular, probably 20, 30 years has resulted in essentially the United States weakening relatively compared to what it was at the start of the 1970s, and especially since the end of the Second World War, and China in particular growing. So if you look at the chart, I think the two most important colors there, well, you can see it on the right side. The US is the color blue, blue graph. That's their share of the world economy. And China on the bottom, that's their share of the world economy. So I think it's quite clear if you look at, abstractly from all the, I think there are about 118 countries on this chart. But if you just look at China and the United States, I think it's quite clear. Most other countries still had more or less their same share of the world economy. But what's really happened is a large chunk of the share of the US economy has been eaten up by China. So,
Sir Sunny?
Of course, yes, what?
Sir Sunny, reminder
Yes.
lang to speak slowly, please, for
Oh,
our
I'm sorry. I
interpreters.
thought I was
Thank
speaking
you.
slowly. Okay. Unfortunately, I thought that was me slow. I'll speak even slower. Okay, I'm challenged to make sense with less words and not hiding behind speaking fast. So the most important takeaway I think from this chart is to see that things have developed in terms of the world economy over the last 40, 50 years. But the biggest change has been vis-a-vis China and the United States. Most other countries in the world, more or less, had their same share of the world economy, but it's really China, which has increased its share of the world economy, that's the red chart below where the Chinese flag is. And the United States has lost more or less a corresponding share of the world economy. They're the blue chart on top. And I think that's the bottom line. That is the economic basis of multipolarity. Basically the rapid rise of China since the 2000s, quite recent in historical, economic, geological time, versus the relative weakening of the United States. In recent years, there's also been talk about the BRICS, about not just China being more assertive, but also Russia and India. I think it's important to highlight Russia and India didn't really expand as much as China, although they did become more assertive, especially with the relative decline of the United States. But at the end of the day, these are just trends. And if you look at a slice of time in 2020, the United States is still the world's dominant economic and military power. Not like it was before previous decades, but it still is now and maybe for some years to come. This next chart shows global growth rates since the 1960s. I think the useful point to highlight with this chart is how basically global growth as a whole has been slowing, especially since the 1970s. And that's even before the right side, the huge collapse with the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've marked out, it's on top, the various periods of severe economic crises from 1970s stagflation, the oil price shock, the 1980s debt crisis, the early 1990s global recession, the dot-com bubble, the stock market bubble exploding in the US in 2000, and of course, most recently, the huge global and financial economic crisis in 2008 until 2009. And this awful pandemic episode we're in the middle right now. I think that yellow line that overlays the trend line going downwards, the main message I think here is that the world capitalist system has been in crisis since the 1970s, which is also the era of neoliberalism and free market globalization. Compared to previous decades, that neoliberal era has seen more frequent episodes of more intense crisis, and as the chart shows, generally slowing growth. And especially since 2008, 2009, it might not be so clear to see because of the pandemic collapse last year, but there actually has been a protracted global stagnation for about a decade since the 2008-2009 crisis. This is important, I think, one, to establish that there is a structural problem of the world capitalist system because of its contradictions, but also because exactly this economic trajectory of crisis is what pushed the neoliberal policy response, which also created its own contradictions and just intensified the trajectory of crisis even further. That's important because that also means that the biggest capitalist powers especially will in a lot of ways become even more hard-pressed to try to surmount this crisis. I don't know if it's too premature, but I think in a lot of ways, it seems that we can actually put a bookend to the period of free market globalization and neoliberalism from the 1980s to 2000s. Some might say it's premature, but on our part, we think it's quite fair because it's quite clear. The last 3 to 4 decades that has seen an overwhelming dominance of free market policies being pushed in a two-faced way because the big capitalist powers always kept their protections as they thought that it was necessary. But the way they were forcing neoliberalism to other countries to get their, especially the backward countries, to get our cheap labor, our cheap raw materials, for them to be able to sell their surplus goods and services. And of course, as outlets for their surplus capital, whether as debt to us or investments in our countries, that period of very aggressive neoliberalism seems to have ended. I think that's for two reasons. One, that momentum of there is no alternative to neoliberalism because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, that's lost all its potency, because we've seen the impact of what happens if you implement neoliberal policies in backward countries for 40 years. It's very striking. We don't have any experience of any new country industrializing after South Korea and Taiwan, because that just really underscores it is impossible for a backward neo-colony to industrialize and develop under a neoliberal framework. So I think that's point number one. It's not as easy to sell or to force neoliberalism because it's so obviously a failure. Second important reason is that even the big capitalist powers are rolling back some of their openness to foreign trade and investment. Their protectionism, they had never let go of their protectionism, but because their crisis has become much worse, not just in terms of frequency, but in terms of depth, especially after 2008, 2009, they're also becoming more protectionist. So I think for those two reasons, it would be fair to say that if we're not at the end, we actually are seeing the end of this neoliberal era on the horizon. But having said that, what has not ended is, and what has not changed, is the need of the big capitalist powers for what they've always needed. Other countries to exploit for their labor, raw materials, markets, and as outlets for their surplus capital. But I think one interesting nuance here is that since the 2000s, the older and more traditional imperialist powers, US, Western Europe, they've actually become more overtly protectionist and have started waging trade wars. Of course, the most well-known is the case of the United States under President Trump, because they knew that even in their own home economies, they were facing a severe blowback from the very rapid globalization. In the case of the United States, the backlash is that by the overconfidence that they can open up their manufacturing sectors, and the overconfidence that even if their manufacturing plants are abroad or subcontracted, that they will still remain a strategically industrial power, they apparently have realized that it's not the case. But in the end, that still erodes their domestic industry, that still erodes their domestic economic strength, pushing them to become more overly protectionist. And that's a little bit different from China, because although the US is becoming more protectionist, they still want other countries to be kept as open as they have been from the last 4 decades of globalization. That's a little bit different in the case of China. China has actually strengthened on the back of strong state control and protectionism ever since. They never let go of that. They never even went into the rhetoric of that they were becoming more open, more globalized, even when they were joining the World Trade Organization. So I don't know if irony is the right word, but with the US and the traditional imperialist powers rolling back on pushing globalization, it's actually China. I think President Xi Jinping had an important policy speech at the World Economic Forum in 2017, where he basically said that he defended the free market, he defended globalization, which actually makes sense because China, as a growing imperialist power, they have an increasing need for cheap labor, cheap raw materials, markets, and outlets overseas that they did not have at home. So I think that's an important little point of difference since the 2000s. Traditional powers, more overtly protectionist, while wanting to keep backward countries open. On the other hand, China, which never let go of their state monopolies and control over the economy, they're actually the ones now waving the banner of globalization. basically because that is what is in their objective interest, to catch up even more, to accelerate their growth even more. If they've squeezed everything they could from the Chinese economy, they need the resources of the rest of the world to pick up the pace. Um, but I think because things have changed really in the last decade, these are just some, I think, just to highlight some key points. Also, among our reasons to think that this era of neoliberal globalization, if not really coming to an end, is really in a period of some kind of change. The banner multilateral institution for globalization, the World Trade Organization, is actually stalled, or has been stalled for about a decade now. And even the number of free trade agreements are losing momentum. Of course, some might say, well, that's because every country has a free trade agreement. Well, that's partly true, but there actually is still a lot of space for more free trade agreements. But as you will see in the next slide, there are much less free trade agreements now. So that's important because in terms of the multilateral trading system or regional and bilateral global trading system, all these battles we were fighting against the WTO and free trade agreements since the 1970s, they're in some way won, but they're in some way also imploding by their own contradictions, especially because of the interests of the big capitalist powers, particularly the US that doesn't want to open up themselves even more. So quite clearly, there is very, very much growth in global trade and investment protectionism, both in terms of trade measures and investment restrictions and regulations. I mean, countries are still continuing to change their policies, but compared to the past, they're changing their policies now towards restrictions rather than liberalization. And there are even some countries, they're not just changing their policies, they're actually terminating these free market, neoliberal inspired investment treaties. So that, I think, is a good sign that at that level, things are really taking a bit of a U-turn. Important examples, of course, are the United States and the UK. The United States, under President Trump, pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. He declared America first, and these don't seem to be changing under President Biden. The trade war with China, the vitriol, and all the accusations against China are actually consistent even with the change in administration, which again also makes sense because it wasn't just Trump's psychotic personality driving that. If anything, he was a good vehicle. His psychotic personality was the best vehicle to become more aggressive against China, their main rising challenger. And of course, the UK pulling out of the European Union with Brexit. So that Anglo-Saxon retreat, I think, from globalization is important because in the 1980s, they were the ones at the forefront under Reagan and Thatcher pushing neoliberalism. On the other hand, China, well, as mentioned earlier, when President Xi Jinping stood before the World Economic Forum, it's actually quite interesting to be reading news accounts because he really was defending free trade and globalization, which was so weird because the economy did not strengthen under a free trade, free market regime. Their economy strengthened from their socialist foundations built up through the sort of very strong state monopoly capitalism of recent decades. And as if, and to prove that isn't just rhetoric, whereas the United States pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, that China pushed successfully its regional comprehensive economic partnership, basically the world's biggest free trade agreement, far exceeding the successor to the TPP, the CPTPP. This, I think, is quite useful to highlight how FTAs just aren't the thing anymore. The WTO was stalled for a lot of reasons. New agreements weren't being signed. The United States blocked the functioning of the WTO's dispute settlement body. So the WTO in effect became toothless after that. If that is what happened on the WTO, it's stalling. But even independently, different countries have stopped entering into free trade agreements. So the blue chart shows the annual additions to free trade agreements every year since the 1950s in this chart. And then the red line shows the cumulative number of free trade agreements. That light blue chart bar on the rightmost side, that needs explanation because it seems to go against the thesis that free trade agreements are declining. But the only reason that there's so many in that in 2020, this is just listing all the new agreements that the EU had to sign because the UK left it. So it's just basically double counting previous trade agreements. So if you ignore that light blue chart, it's quite clear free trade agreements started increasing in the 1990s, basically plateaued in 2008, 2009, and have been falling since then. It's the same actually if you talk about trade measures and investment measures. The chart on the left, the color red part, that shows how many protectionist trade measures have been implemented since the 2008-2009 global crisis. Almost 30,000 protectionist trade measures have been implemented, mainly by the G20 members, and especially by, as expected, the US, China, actually Russia, India, and the EU as well. So that chart on the left is quite important because the red chart shows the protectionist measures, the green chart below shows the liberalizing measures. It's quite clear there are many more protectionist than liberalizing trade measures. So like tariff protections, subsidies to exporters, government procurement, prioritizing national producers, that kind of stuff. The chart on the right is also quite important. The chart on the right shows not trade measures, but investment measures. So the green line on top shows when countries have changed their investment policies towards liberalization. The red line below shows when countries have changed their investment policies to become more restrictive. And again, parallel to the increase in trade protection measures, we are also seeing a general trend towards increasing investment restrictions, investment regulations. So apart from their increasing restrictions, we are actually also seeing, in effect, reversals of international liberalizing investment agreements. This chart here shows that how in the last decade, more or less, since 2010, nearly 200 countries have effectively terminated their previously signed liberalizing investment agreements. We listed a few prominent examples here. Indonesia terminated investment treaties with over 20 countries. India terminated investment treaties with nearly 60 countries, including the UK, France, Germany, Spain, and Sweden. South Africa with 13 countries. And then, well, in Latin America, sorry, I didn't bother listing it down. Ecuador, Venezuela, Bolivia have done the same thing. So the idea there is to establish that in the last 10 years, there is much more trade protection, investment restrictions, deregulations, and to a significant degree, reversals on multilateral and bilateral treaties and agreements. So if that's the overall landscape, well, of course, the biggest and most interesting point of conflict is between China and the United States. It's, of course, I think it's a structural reality. In a finite world, rising powers will always challenge established powers. There will always be, in a finite world with uneven development and aspirants to dominance, there will always be structural conflict, structural tension, and competition. And until those are resolved, these can only intensify. And of course, the biggest fault line right now is between the most established superpower, the United States, and the fastest rising counter hegemonic power, China. So I'm not going to go into, of course, the so many other geopolitical military aspects, but just to highlight foreign economic policies are, of course, vital tools for achieving that kind of domination. And when you talk about foreign economic policies being tools for imperialist domination, there are more or less two clusters of policies we're talking about: trade and investment policies and development finance. In terms of trade and investment policies, I think it's quite important. Apart from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the world's biggest free trade agreement, well, accepting the WTO, of course. There's, of course, the very much hyped Belt and Road Initiative, which is a whole package of measures of giving aid, providing infrastructure, connecting other economies to the Chinese economy, going as far west as Europe, as far south as South Asia, and all the way down to Southeast Asia. Again, it's estimated to cost a huge $4 to as much as $8 trillion until about 2030, 2040. But of course, in the age of imperialism, finance capital also has a key role apart from questions of trade and investment. And China has started to play the development finance game with very much increased commercial debt, lending, and official development assistance to backward countries, both on its own account bilaterally, but also through two multilateral banks it's created, the New Development Bank and the Infrastructure Investment Bank. And one, I didn't bother putting it here, but one important indicator, I think, of how fast China has expanded into this realm of using finance and capital to influence other countries. China's portfolio of development lending right now, bilaterally, not even counting what it might have leveraged through the AIIB or the NDB, it's about $490 billion. And that's almost as much as the World Bank's loan portfolio. So basically, in the span of 15, 20 years, China has caught up with the World Bank, which has been in operation since the end of the Second World War. And of course, the main objectives of any foreign policy, economic or political, its main objectives are to get economic benefits for the Chinese economy, for Chinese capitalists, to shape domestic politics abroad, again, for China's own geopolitical interests, but also to increase its soft power, interactions with politicians, with academics, the private sector, to some degree, even civil society. I think taken up too much time with that, but focusing on the Philippines. So where does this put the Philippines? As with anything, it's where the Philippines locates itself in the in battles between imperialist powers and the world capitalist system. In effect, it's a truism. It's, as with anything, it's a matter of choice and the balance of political forces within the country. The rise of China seemed to open up a kind of alternative path for the country away from long-standing U.S. dominance. And President Duterte, when he came to power, he had fun cursing President Obama. He had fun standing up during a state visit to China, saying, "I declare a separation from the United States," and all of that. So the question is the Philippines really starting down a new path? That's actually a very important question, because this new multipolar world and the shakeup of the pre-existing multilateral, regional, bilateral arrangements, and of course the contradictions between the big powers, and didn't go into too much detail, even among the lesser capitalist powers, actually all of this greatly expands the possibilities for the Philippines to chart a different development path for itself. There's so much more opportunities now in terms of our country's foreign economic relations. If only there was a strong leadership willing, able, and with a political backing from domestic political forces, from the mass movements, from the general public, to implement more sovereign, more nationalist policies for national economic development. So is the Philippines under the Duterte administration treading that path of alternative development? Clearly not. I mean, we wouldn't be where we are now. I think we'd be hailing genuinely, setting up an independent economy, independent country if it was happening. So it's clearly not happening. So if that real alternative isn't happening, is there at least a change between China and the United States in this new multipolar environment? Well, we'd argue it has been an episode the last 5 years of leaning towards China. There is a clear drift in some respects, but I think if you step back from all the political bombast and controversy, maybe not as much as that bombast and controversy might give the impression of. Stepping back, it seems that US domination of our politics, which will be taken up later, but also the economy, it's been shaken and steered, but it's actually still quite intact. And of course, underlying all that, foreign domination and our resulting neocolonial backwardness has become worse in the last 5 years and is more entrenched than ever. This chart shows the different economic sectors of the economy. The blue line summarizes production, the most important sectors for creating value, creating economic surplus, creating jobs, raising incomes, improving productivity, creating dynamism. The blue line sums up manufacturing, agriculture, and construction. The orange line is the service sector. The red line below are utilities, telecommunications, water, electricity. What this chart tries to show in sort of some very broad strokes in a very stylized way is that the Philippines started to collapse. Its production sector started to collapse at the start of the 1980s after the first World Bank structural adjustment loans in the late 1970s. And that's basically, I think it's a trend that hasn't changed under President Duterte. So I think categorically, in terms of overcoming long-standing neo-colonial structural backwardness, clearly we are still seeing, even under President Duterte, the continued neoliberal destruction of the economy. And it's actually reshaping for the interests of foreign capital. After 40 years of trade and investment liberalization, hopefully it's the end of that moment, but that's a political question. Philippine manufacturing is as small as it was in the 1950s. It's the most foreign-dominated in Philippine history. Agriculture is its smallest share in the country's history. Sometime in the mid-1990s, the Philippines became a service economy more than a producing economy. You'll see later in the next slide, unemployment was at record highs even before COVID-19, and that collapse of the domestic economy, domestic production, increase in unemployment, worsening quality of jobs, that's what has made the Philippines the most over-reliant it has ever been on overseas work and overseas remittances. So these are just two charts. The left side shows basically the number of unemployed since the start of the neoliberal era. It's chronically rising. Someone might nitpick, yeah, but that's growing unemployment, but the population is growing. Counter argument, the chart on the right shows unemployment rates, correcting for a cheat the government did to not count so many unemployed. But the two charts should establish in the neoliberal era, because of the collapse of Philippine production, because of the continued adherence to these free market globalization policies, Philippine unemployment has risen and has stayed with some variation at record highs for the last 35 years. And this chronic structural unemployment actually comes on top of a bloating of the informal sector, even among those who are employed. So even among those who are employed, they have such low earnings, they have such irregular earnings, they have no benefits, they have no protections. So even these horrible unemployment rates don't even actually count the joblessness and the poor quality of jobs even among those working, which goes far in explaining chronic poverty. The Philippine economy is where it is now, not, didn't fall from the sky, but basically after, many decades of the United States, since so-called flag independence in 1946, through many decades of the Philippine economy being shaped by the United States. First through unequal agreements right after so-called independence. After that, through dozens of IMF and World Bank programs worth tens of billions of dollars. And then since 1995 with the WTO and so many free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties. And if these are more or less a trajectory of foreign impositions, I think the worst part now is that US imperialism doesn't have to impose things anymore because our economic managers have so totally embraced the imperialist agenda. They're doing it for them even without these external agreements. Opening up the economy has worked. Philippine investments, foreign investments in the Philippines have increased, whether as a share of the economy, the chart on the left side, on an annual basis, or as a share of the economy on the right side on a cumulative basis. So right now, from the start of the neoliberal era, had maybe 1.5% of the economy equivalent in foreign investment. It's at over 26% right now. So the opening up of the economy really opened us up to foreign capital. So combining this opening up of the economy to foreign capital, the taking over of domestic manufacturing, the closure of domestic manufacturing with the growing population and the inability to produce, that has actually also resulted in record trade deficits. So in the end, to try to summarize that whole neoliberal restructuring of the economy that the Duterte administration is embracing and continuing, how has imperialism, how has foreign monopoly capitalism gained from the Philippines? They've gained in so many ways. I think the most brazen face of it is over 10, as much as 12 million of our laborers exported. Some of these include non-working family members, but they're eventually going to be working abroad as well. We have to count about 1.5 million workers in special economic zones. Maybe 600,000, perhaps as much as 1.3 million workers in call centers, business process outsourcing centers. Some of those overlap with the count in special economic zones. Over $50 billion worth of mineral exports in the last 20 years, nearly $70 billion worth of agriculture and forestry exports, again, over the last 20 years. And I think the most obvious way that capital is sucked from the economy, $250 billion in foreign debt payments since the start of the neoliberal era in 1980. So that restructuring of the economy to give foreign monopoly capital what it wants, we are not seeing any reversals at all under the Duterte administration. I have a few more minutes left. So where's the Philippines between the United States and China? Well, first, the Philippines is a small country. We have the 13th largest population in the world, but only the 39th largest economy. So we're disproportionately tiny and backward. These three charts just highlight how vulnerable the Philippine economy is put against the US and China. The top chart shows United States GDP, $21 trillion. Chinese GDP, about 15 trillion. The Philippines, just 361 billion. In terms of military expenditures, again, US, actually much more than China, negligible for the Philippines and below the population. But I think also important to highlight, the Philippines has huge geopolitical strategic significance. But in terms of an outlet for foreign investment, the United States has invested over $8 trillion abroad. China, including Hong Kong, has invested over $4.3 billion abroad. They've only invested a fraction of that in the Philippines. They have, in terms of economic interests, they have much bigger interests elsewhere. The total foreign investment in the country, all countries, not just the US and China, is 103 billion. You'll see later, it's only about 20 plus billion foreign investment of the US in the country right now. Just to highlight also, I think when we talk about economic measures, of course, there's a direct economic benefit from our neo-colonial transactions with the US and China. But also, I think we have to also understand, sometimes it's not all about making money. Sometimes it's not all about the capital profiting, especially right now with this sort of conflict between the US and China. Sometimes it's just about building deeper connections with corrupt politicians, with local business, and with other countries to increase your soft power in the country. Where's the Philippines vis-a-vis the US and the Philippines vis-a-vis China? Just to summarize, there was a rhetorical separation of President Duterte from the United States, but undoubtedly, US economic dominance is unchallenged. There's been no movement at all versus any of the US transnational corporations exploiting Philippine labor and natural resources. Our economic agenda is still actually being pushed by the US desire, whether it's liberalizing utilities or foreign investments, our retail trade sector, changing the constitution, or even tax reforms. This all actually very much have the involvement of the United States. On the other hand, that drift is happening to China with much more accommodation and openness to Chinese capital. The headline, of course, is Chinese support for build infrastructure projects, but also, unfortunately, exploitation of the West Philippine Sea, with even some presidential candidates now expressing the same openness to Chinese helping us exploit the West Philippine Sea, and also increase Chinese foreign direct investment in the telecom sector, mining, steel, and energy. And of course, just last year, the Philippines joining the China-centric RCEP. I'm going to wrap up, but these are quite important numbers just to stress those general conclusions. The RCEP is quite important as a free trade agreement because it really is the world's biggest free trade agreement, especially with the TPP of the US not continuing. But it's a China trade agreement. Nearly 60% of the RCEP economies are just in China. In the Philippines, it's just a little smidgen. It's like 1.4% of the RCEP economy. So China dominates the RCEP. It's not ASEAN, it's really China, and they have the biggest economy, the most advanced economy, astride Japan, and they really have the most to gain. China actually is a long time the biggest trading partner of the Philippines, but I think it's important that this doesn't actually all refer to the Philippines trading with China. In the era of globalization, all these global supply chains, global value chains, a lot of the Philippine exports to China are not by Filipino firms, but by Chinese firms, by Japanese firms, by US firms, trading with Chinese firms, Japanese firms, US firms in the Chinese economy. So unlike maybe 40, 50 years ago, trade figures don't really reflect now interactions between economies. They actually hide that it's monopoly capital subsidiaries dealing with each other. But notwithstanding that, China is the biggest trading partner of the Philippines, and the TNC is based in the Philippines. Now, under Duterte, I'm going to wrap up here. In terms of investment, trade, and debt, under Duterte, Chinese investment has grown much more than before. But even if it has grown much more than before, Chinese investment is still a very small share of total foreign investment in the country. At just $3.5 billion total stock of Chinese investment in the country, that's a distant fifth to Japan's 29 billion and the European Union's 23 billion, and the United States' 18 billion. So it's just a tiny 3.4% of total foreign investment in the country. In terms of debt, yes, under Duterte, Chinese debt has grown more than at any time in its history, but China is still a very distant ninth foreign creditor after Japan, the Netherlands, US, UK, Taiwan, Singapore, the World Bank, and the ADB. Total Philippine ODA from China is just 1.6% of total external debt. So that adds ODA official aid, and even commercial debt. It's a very tiny portion of debt of the external debt of the Philippines. But even in terms of ODA, which was meant to be the banner incentive to be friends with China, China is a distant fourth official creditor after Japan, the World Bank, and the ADB. China only takes up 2.5% of total overseas development aid in the country. And just to wrap up here, there has been a lot of talk about the Chinese debt trap, the BRI, especially infrastructure, but a lot of it is just like our president, a lot of hot air, a lot of promises, a lot of bombast, but nothing really happening. I mean, it's also might very well be that's just Duterte speaking, the Philippine government speaking. I don't know what the Chinese government has said. Because, for instance, the flagship program of the Philippine government, the Build infrastructure program, it's worth 6.7 trillion pesos. How much has China given? Out of a 6.7 trillion portfolio, China's only given 48 billion pesos for 5 projects, and it's only tentative for 247 billion more for 4 other projects, also very real intensive projects. So basically, out of the trillions of pesos of target infrastructure projects, out of almost 6,000 projects, China has only given less than 50 billion so far, with a promise of maybe at most 250 billion more for not even 10 projects, just 9 projects. A lot of promises, but it's not really materializing. So just to wrap everything up, I'm sorry I went far over time. In this multipolar environment, and despite the bombast of President Duterte, the US is still undoubtedly, even just looking at the economic aspect, still the dominant imperialist power in the Philippines. And again, imperialist powers will always be exploiting, plundering us, whether it's American or Chinese or wherever. Our basic goal, of course, is to assert economic sovereignty for national development and uphold a genuinely independent foreign economic policy that puts Filipino people's interests on top of everything else. I apologize for taking too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Sunny, for that great discussion on the context and the economic basis of multipolarity. Also for the emphasis on the pressing need for the Philippines to assert economic sovereignty and an independent foreign policy. Thank you as well to our translator for the reminder to speak more slowly. So to our webinar participants who would like to ask questions or who want to share comments about the presentation, please use the Zoom Q&A or question and answer button. And if you're viewing this webinar on Facebook, you may comment on the Facebook Live video. We have also seen some of the questions already. Thank you very much. We will get to them as well as your comments during the open forum later on. So please also note that the Secretariat can also provide copies of the presentations and notes in Filipino and in English to our participants. So please message or send them your emails if you're interested. And now we move on to our next speaker. He is here to talk about fighting 2 competing imperialist powers in a multipolar world. He is currently the Secretary General of Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, New Patriotic Alliance or Bayan, and a member of the International Coordinating Committee of ILPS. Let's all welcome Renato Nato Reyes.
Hello, good evening. Can you hear me? All right, so I will proceed. I would also like to apologize in advance because I have been quite sick the past few days, and it's quite hard to talk for long periods. But let me proceed now with my presentation. May I ask for assistance for the slides from our tech team? So the Philippines is facing a very complex situation brought about by a multipolar world, and to some extent brought about by a very confusing and oftentimes incoherent president in the person of Rodrigo Duterte. But the Filipino people have no choice but to fight 2 imperialist powers who are out to exploit the country, and the president who is subservient to both. We remain conscious of the contradictions between these 2 imperialist powers, the US and China, as we try to find ways to advance the demands of the people for national sovereignty and genuine democracy. Now, the Philippines remains a neo-colony, a US neo-colony, but it cannot be denied that under Duterte, the influence of China has grown significantly compared to past regimes. Is the slide on? There it is. All right. So next slide, please. Duterte's subservience to the two imperialist powers have intensified the domestic crisis and regional conflict. The domestic economy and security policies, and even the country's pandemic response are influenced by the contradictions between the two imperialist powers and Duterte's subservience to both. Now, the Philippines is at a crossroads now, with the presidential elections nearing and with both the US and China trying to influence the outcome of the polls by supporting the candidates they think will advance their agenda. Aside from the South China Sea, the 2022 elections in the Philippines would be another flashpoint in the worsening contradictions between the two imperialist powers. Sunny has provided, next slide please. Sunny has provided a lot of background on conflicts between the US and China. So in this next slide, we just make a review. The US has a policy of encirclement and containment of China as a rising global power. And the US has set up military bases and undertaken forward troop deployment in East Asia. You have bases in Japan, Korea, troops stationed in the Philippines, and US troops also down up to Australia. Now, China, meanwhile, next slide please, has claimed 90% of the South China Sea in violation of international law and conducted legal reclamation activities and established military bases as well in a move to counter the US encirclement. Now, one casualty here is the Philippines exclusive economic zone, which China has been claiming and which has caused a lot of problems for Filipino fishermen. Now, on June 30, Duterte won, was sworn in as Philippine president and promised to uphold an independent foreign policy. Next slide. On July 17, 2016, the Philippines won a landmark victory before the UN Permanent Court of Arbitration, which invalidated the 9-line claim of China over the entire South China Sea. Now, this case was filed during the term of Duterte's predecessor, the late Benigno Aquino III. The ruling upheld the Philippines' exclusive economic zone under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and declared illegal China's restrictions of access to our EEZ, which includes Scarborough Shoal. Now, Filipino fishermen had long complained of being driven away from the rich fishing grounds that they rely on for their livelihood. And this has been a highly political and emotional issue for Filipinos. Now, this decision came at a time when Duterte claimed that he was upholding an independent foreign policy in relation to the US. He was engaging the revolutionary forces in peace negotiations, and he promised reforms. Duterte criticized the US, President Obama, when the latter raised concerns over the conduct of the Philippines' war on drugs, which had already claimed many lives. But an important development was, by October 2016, next slide please, Duterte made his first visit to Beijing as he announced his pivot towards China and Russia and his separation, quote-unquote separation from the US. So Duterte was saying it's China and Russia and the Philippines against the world. But it was actually a carefully crafted pitch to get loans and aid from China by providing them with what they wanted to hear. Of course, Duterte would not really separate from the United States. He could not because the military establishment that supported his regime was traditionally pro-US. His economic team were diehard neoliberals schooled by US agencies, and the dominant business and economic interests in the country were pro-US. Next slide, please. So as the Duterte regime unfolded, it became clear what his foreign policy was really about. Duterte was subservient to two imperialist powers that were in conflict with each other. It was a very dangerous gamble, to say the least. Duterte would be squeezed by the two big powers. We would be caught in the middle of two colliding giants. This placed the Philippines at a very huge disadvantage economically, politically, and militarily. Now, China's moving on. Okay, so China promised to fund the ambitious, next slide, the Build infrastructure program with the Duterte regime. But as of 2020, only one project, the Chico River Irrigation Project, has actually taken off. And another dam project known as the Kiliwa Dam has yet to begin. And China has been criticized as being slow in providing loans for Duterte's flagship programs. Two big-ticket China-funded projects were also shelved in the last quarter of 2019 because they were deemed unfeasible. China has enticed Duterte with these Chinese loans for infrastructure as a source of bureaucratic corruption. This will keep Duterte and his big business cronies happy while China gets its way in the West Philippine Sea. So we often hear Duterte say in his late night speeches that we are so indebted to China for their generosity that we dare not make aggressive assertions of our sovereign rights in our exclusive economic zone. So Duterte has practically waved the red flag that we cannot do anything insofar as enforcing the positive victory that we won in the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Next slide, please. Now, during the pandemic, China again played an important supporting role to the Duterte regime. When the Duterte government failed to procure vaccines at the earliest possible time due to documentary deficiencies, and when it became clear that the Philippines would be the last Southeast Asian country to receive vaccines, Duterte ran to China to secure vaccine donations. Later on, most of the vaccines that would be procured, next slide please, most of the vaccines that would be procured by the Philippine government, or 55%, or 36 million doses, would be from China. Now, to this day, the Filipino people have no idea how much these vaccines cost because the Philippine government is telling us that there's a non-disclosure agreement and they cannot tell the people how our money is being spent during the pandemic. Chinese companies have also, next slide please, Chinese companies have also benefited from hefty supply contracts from the Philippine government involving personal protective equipment to be used during the COVID pandemic. In a Senate investigation, an ongoing investigation right now, the procurement officials of the Duterte government said that it was the Chinese ambassador to the Philippines who recommended or introduced them to suppliers from China. And these transactions are now the subject of corruption investigations involving billions of pesos, dummy companies, and possibly even money laundering. Now, in exchange for Chinese loans with questionable terms, overpriced supply contracts attended by bureaucratic corruption, the Duterte government has kept a subservient attitude towards China in relation to the West Philippine Sea to the detriment of the Filipino people. Now, next slide, please. In response to the growing influence of China with the Duterte regime, the United States, meanwhile, has committed to increase military aid to the Philippines for Duterte's counterinsurgency program and counter-terror campaign. And this has resulted in massive human rights violations in the country. The US has also conducted, next slide please, Operation Pacific Eagle, which is a counter-terror operation in Mindanao against so-called ISIS-inspired groups. The US was heavily involved in the destruction of Marawi City in the operation against the ISIS-inspired groups in 2017. Now, I'd like to call your attention to this interesting finding of the U.S. Inspector General who assessed the U.S. Operation Pacific Eagle Philippines. He said, Sean O'Donnell said, in general, efforts to reduce extremism in the Philippines do not appear to have made a substantial difference since the launch of Operation Pacific Eagle. We have seen little progress in improving the economic, social, and political conditions in that part of the country. So, what really is the purpose of these US-funded military operations in the Philippines if they really have not made any significant dent on the so-called IS terrorist groups. Next slide, please. The U.S. also planned to ramp up its joint military exercises with the Philippines if not for the pandemic and if not for Duterte's temporary termination of the Visiting Forces Agreement. So the BFA is the military agreement that allows U.S. troops to be stationed in the Philippines. At the start of 2020, Duterte said he would terminate the VFA after the U.S. canceled the visa of a former police chief turned senator accused of involvement in the bloody drug war. The Duterte tantrum was later on resolved after former US President Trump and Duterte talked on the phone in April of that same year. So after the phone call, Trump and Duterte spoke. Convicted American Marine Joseph Scott Pemberton, who killed a Filipino trans woman, Jennifer Laude, was granted absolute pardon and was released. Military exercises were allowed to resume as the U.S. delivered millions of dollars in new weapons and equipment to the Philippines. Now, during the term of Biden, the promise of vaccine donations from the U.S. was also dangled to ensure the withdrawal of the earlier termination of the VFA by 2021. So the U.S. supposedly donated a combined 6 million doses of Johnson & Johnson and Moderna vaccines in July 2021. So the VFA is operational again. Next slide, please. So you can see in this slide, Duterte, February 7, Duterte orders termination of VFA. Then a few months later, after the Trump dialogue, Philippines suspends the VFA termination for now. So it's terminated, but it's not yet really effective. Then next slide, please. By the time of the Biden administration, when the U.S. Defense Secretary visited the Philippines, Duterte effectively withdrew the termination of the VFA. So the VFA is back on, along with the promise of continued military aid to the Philippine government. So next slide, please. So what are we doing? Bayan had made clear early on its stand that the Philippines should not be caught in the claws of either the dragon or the eagle. It was not in our interest to choose one imperialist master over another. It is in our interest to have genuine sovereignty and democracy in the Philippines and to free ourselves from all forms of foreign intervention. This multipolar world has given rise to various anti-imperialist struggles in the Philippines over the past 5 years, both against policies and programs of China and the US. So while there is high awareness now among the people on the issues concerning China, there's still work to be done in exposing the role of the US in human rights violations and underdevelopment in the Philippines. We are waging these campaigns side by side with different stresses depending on current developments. Over the past 5 years, we have waged a broad campaign called Atin ang Pinas in defense of our sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea. So you can see this is our June 12, 2021 Independence Day protest. We have worked with legal luminaries, environmental groups, and fisherfolk groups in opposing China's illegal reclamation and destruction of our marine resources. There's also a campaign against onerous China loans, such as those in the Chico River. Next slide, please. Irrigation project and the $300 million Kaliwa Dam project, which carry with them also onerous provisions that would allow China to control Philippines' patrimonial assets in the event of a loan default. Now, in relation to Duterte's pandemic response, we have also called out the Philippine government for bureaucratic corruption tied with procurement deals with Chinese suppliers and possible money laundering activities, and the over-reliance on Chinese-made vaccines where pricing is non-transparent and where efficacy against the Delta variant appears to be lower or waning compared to other vaccines. Meanwhile, Bayan has consistently opposed, next slide, U.S. intervention in the Philippines. Thousands marched in Manila and clashed with the police in November 2017 during the visit of U.S. President Donald Trump. Bayan also campaigned against the construction of new military bases in Philippine territory inside Philippine military camps and has also opposed Operation Pacific Eagle. Bayan has also called attention to U.S. counter operations and involvement in counterinsurgency, and Bayan has also opposed the passage of a new terror law. The history of the terror laws in the Philippines this was also upon the insistence of the United States. Next slide. We are opposing the attacks on LUMAD schools and LUMAD communities that have been targeted under the US-inspired counterinsurgency drive of the Duterte government. We have opposed the anti-terror law, and the case is currently pending before the Philippine Supreme Court. Now, there's also a need to, next slide, expose the level of US government support for the AFP, Armed Forces of the Philippines, in the commission of human rights violations during the conduct of the counterinsurgency campaign. It's not just the armed combatants that the AFP is targeting, but also the unarmed above ground activists who are fighting for land, justice, and self-determination. We are supporting the passage of the Philippine Human Rights Act, which seeks to limit US military aid to the Philippines in light of human rights violations taking place. Now, next slide, to the SONA protests. Despite the pandemic, protests were held to mark the final State of the Nation address of Duterte this year, where groups assailed the role of the US and China in the worsening crisis of the Philippines, including the widespread human rights violations, neoliberal economic impositions, and violations of Philippine sovereignty. Now, in the last part, Crossroads 2022. The Philippines will be at another crossroads next year as the presidential elections take place. While we believe that the elections do not provide a thoroughgoing change, the outcome of the elections is important insofar as the continuity of Duterte's policy is concerned. Duterte is the only president in the history of the Philippines who will seek to run again as vice president. So from president, he will run as vice president. A move largely seen as a way to avoid prosecution when his term ends in 2022. He faces an investigation by the ICC, where arrest warrants could be issued against him and other officials. If he decides to withdraw his candidacy, there's the option of having his daughter run for president and fulfill their dynastic plans in Malacanang. Now, there are several challengers to Duterte, and there are ongoing efforts to unite different candidates against the incumbent. A lot has changed since 2019, and the once formidable Duterte coalition has been fragmented due to competing ruling class interests. More importantly, the people are more than ever critical of Duterte after more than a year of failed pandemic response, corruption, human rights violations, and attacks on our sovereignty. So a broad united front has taken shape and is determined to end the Duterte regime and assert national sovereignty against the US and China. Now, the US and China will not be innocent bystanders when the elections happen. We believe that they are keenly observing developments in the Philippines and are lining up support for candidates who will continue the neoliberal economic programs and who will be supportive of the US or China's imperialist interests and agenda in the Philippines. So we expect foreign intervention in the automated polls, foreign intervention in social media operations meant to influence public opinion, and in the actual clandestine financing of the campaigns of certain candidates. Expect also increased suppression of the people in Duterte's bid to remain in power and secure himself from accountability when his term ends. The notorious National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, which has adopted the US whole-of-nation approach to counterinsurgency, is expected to unleash more state terror in a bid to prevent progressives from winning in the upcoming elections. There has been, however, a strong pushback against the NTF-LCAF in the past year. So to close, the mass movement in the Philippines relies on the mobilization of various oppressed sectors. The last slide, please. The mass movement in the Philippines relies on the mobilization of various oppressed sectors in asserting national sovereignty against China and the US. It holds to account the puppet Duterte government and the ruling elite for betrayal of the national interests of the people. It unites with other oppressed peoples of the world against imperialism and for genuine peace. While the mass movement will engage in the elections and field progressive candidates and support opposition candidates who can defeat Duterte, it is also important to look beyond the limits of the elections and to be vigilant against foreign intervention in the conduct of these elections. Only by ending the neo-colonial status of the Philippines can we have a truly independent foreign policy and a truly democratic society. So I end my presentation there. Apologies, still not feeling well, but would be willing to accept questions after this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kanato, for that very timely and a very critical discussion. We hope you get better soon. What you've made very clear is that Filipinos have this urgent task of asserting national sovereignty and genuine democracy, even or especially when the 2022 elections is drawing near. And by now, it should be clear to Filipinos and allies of the Filipino people that we must oppose all forms of imperialist intervention and carry on with our anti-imperialist struggles while also holding accountable the Duterte regime and exposing the role of both US and China in our underdevelopment and in their human rights violations against our people. Okay, so we'd also like to thank our participants. Thank you for listening intently. We are currently live on the ILPS Facebook page. So if you have any questions addressed to our speakers, please comment them on the live stream video and for Facebook viewers and in the Q&A box for the Zoom participants. We will be addressing these questions in the open forum, which will be happening in a bit. But for now, we will be having a 5-minute break. While on break, we will be flashing a music video by Dapayan T Cultura Iti Cordillera or DKK as performed by Children of Cordillera. And we will also be showing wonderful photos of global protests held last September 21. These protests were organized by our international allies who actively support the Filipinos' struggle to end the US Duterte regime. So thank you very much and we'll see you in 5 minutes.
Remember Mother Nature.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our webinar entitled Imperialism in a Multipolar World. Where does the Philippines stand? Now we officially start the open forum. We will be addressing the questions that were sent to us or shared through the chat box or through the Facebook live stream comments. So maybe I can start with a question for Sir Nato. Sir Nato, where do you think will the Philippines be, or what will be its role in the context of the so-called rebuilding of the imperialist countries after the pandemic? Oh, maybe we can address a question to Sir Sunny first, since Nato isn't here. Okay, for Sir Sunny,
Hi.
Sir Sunny,
Sorry,
are you there?
sorry.
Okay. Sige,
Um, can
Sir
you
Nato,
repeat the
I'll just
question?
repeat. Yeah, okay.
I was
Sir
just
Nato, where do you think will the Philippines be, or what will be its role in the context of the so-called rebuilding of the imperialist countries after the pandemic?
rebuilding off.
Rebuilding of the imperialist countries after the pandemic.
Well, what we're seeing is that the big powers are really taking advantage of the pandemic and the very backward and economically weak state of the Philippines. So we've seen that in the way they have dangled vaccines uh, to be able to get concessions, to strengthen their hand in the West Philippine Sea, and to justify the retention of the visiting forces agreement. They will definitely uh, find ways, to take advantage of the Philippines situation right now, where um, it registered the biggest drop in its GDP since World War II. They would take advantage of the cheap labor as a result of the massive unemployment that has happened due to the pandemic. There is a push again for increased liberalization, more liberalization, this time of public utilities, as a way to attract investments and help in economic recovery after the debilitating effects of the pandemic. So I think, the imperialist powers will find a way to take advantage of the crisis generated by the pandemic for their own gains, and again, to the detriment of the Filipino people.
Thank you, Sir Nato. Sir Sunny, would you like to add? Or do you want me to read the question again? Okay, I
I'm
have
okay,
another
thanks.
question for you. It's from the Zoom question and answer box. Someone's asking, isn't it that imperialism is inherently protectionist, which shows that
Mm.
neoliberalism is fake news and is meant to ensure opening countries to TNCs?
Uh, um, Actually, yes. That's why I remember in the slide I made sure to say it's two-faced neoliberalism, because the two phases are, they want to open up the backward countries while they want to protect themselves as much as they can. And even in the height of neoliberalism in the last 4 decades, the US actually was protecting its steel industry, its aviation industry, and well, of course its banking industry and a lot of other industries. So yes, that is true. It's a very two-faced approach to economic policy making. So yeah, if I didn't make it clear earlier, I apologize.
Sir Sunny, another question for you, also from
Mhm.
the Zoom Q&A. Has there been a systematic study on how much of the current deep global crisis is really due directly to the pandemic? And how much of it is due to the lockdowns and other
Mhm.
draconian restrictions on people's mobility? He is explaining that there's a difference between COVID's
Mhm.
direct effects and those that are due to COVID lockdowns.
Yeah. I haven't seen any. I think I've tried to look hard, especially in the Philippine context, but I'm also abroad. I haven't seen anyone try to do that. But of course, that's because it's very hard to disentangle the two. But I do completely agree. The economic collapse in the Philippines, it's gotten to the point we can't blame the pandemic for the Philippine economic collapse. The Philippine economy collapsed by as much as it did because the government implemented these harsh lockdowns for 18 months. So I completely agree with the spirit of the question that the pandemic versus the lockdowns, that is something worth disentangling. But offhand, I mean, I might not have the imagination for it, and I haven't seen anyone do that kind of disentangling. But again, I do agree completely with the spirit of the question. What the Philippines is facing right now, and I'm pretty sure what many other countries are experiencing in terms of the economy, was because of some very, very harsh and in many cases unnecessary lockdowns.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
For Sir Nato, Carol has several questions here in the Q&A chat box. She's asking, isn't it a fact that the Duterte regime is perceived to be more of a China vassal than a US client regime? Why is this so? And she's also asking, how has the left tried to raise public awareness that the Philippines persists as a US neo-colony and the Philippine state is a client regime?
Well, if you base it on media reports, you would get the impression that the Philippine president is really cozying up to Xi Jinping and the Chinese government. But if you look at the more behind the scenes, economic fundamentals, if you look at how the Philippine government approaches its counterinsurgency, counter-terror, how the whole military and police establishment have been traditionally following the U.S. Counterinsurgency programs, no? And um, uh, basically, as Sunny said, the still dominant economic interest in the Philippines would still be the U.S. We cannot just accept the conclusion that Duterte is simply a puppet of China. The Philippines remains a neo-colony of the United States. If Duterte really wanted to extricate from the U.S., why isn't until now he hasn't abrogated the Mutual Defense Treaty, the Visiting Forces Agreement, and all other unequal agreements with the United States? He has not. No, he has merely done tantrums, and he has demanded some increased aid, but he is not willing to part with the U.S. influence over our military, over security concerns. It's important, I think, to educate the people, to inform the people of what's happening and how deeply entrenched the U.S. is in the Philippines right now. If you look at the drug war, if you look at the NTF-LCAC, if you look at the way that they use the term communist terrorist, which is how the U.S. described the enemy in Vietnam, no? In the 1960s. No? These are just some of the ways that the U.S. Is able to exert such influence on Philippine society, and it is the task of the progressives to expose that situation, what the U.S. is doing, and to demand that we rid ourselves of all forms of U.S. intervention in our lives.
Thank you po. We have two more questions, one for Sir Nato and another for Sir Sunny. Sir Nato, can I ask you? Okay, so
Go ahead.
Carol has another question. Does the left in the Philippines acknowledge shortcomings in exposing the U.S. role in the backward and worsening economic crisis and in the bloody political repression in the guise of counterterrorism?
I think that was covered in my presentation. We already said that there is a lot more that we have to do in uncovering the involvement of the U.S. In counterinsurgency, in counter-terror legislation, in other aspects of the Philippine military and the workings of the Duterte regime. And I think another issue that we would need to thoroughly expose in the coming months would be how both the US and China would be trying to influence the outcome of the elections. They will do it through the automated polls, through the automated election system. They will do it through the manipulation of public opinion using social media. So these are all issues that we still need to take up, because apparently the public is not yet too keen on how foreign powers actually, intervene and influence the outcome of elections of neo colonies like the Philippines. There are so many movies about that. We just need to, show and explain this to the people that this is really happening, and this has happened before many times. That's all.
Thank you. For Sir Sunny, what is Ibon's critique of the WEF's Great Reset agenda, which has been more or less adopted by the G7's recent COVID-era Build Back Better program? Will the G7 BBB enhance imperialist collusion or their rivalries? Does the Great Reset or BBB favor China's drive to dominance, or is the West's strategy to counter it?
I haven't studied the Great Reset in much detail because the few things I read about it from the World Economic Forum, it said all the right things. It had all these nice words like resiliency, sustainability, more equality, and stuff like that, strengthening systems, social contract. But the thing is, it was the World Economic Forum website. So it's you're very skeptical from the very beginning what the wordsmiths in the World Economic Foundation are about, but World Economic Forum are about. But then the little bit that I did read about it, the Great Reset seemed to be basically an attempt to an acknowledgement of the problems of capitalism, an acknowledgement that it is stirring a lot of unrest. It is stirring a lot of questioning against even capitalism, with so many more people entertaining the socialist alternative by whatever definition. So my general feeling from the Great Reset by the WEF, it seems to be an attempt to humanize capitalism. And the worst part that really stuck to me, it seemed to be a way to have governments subsidize the private sector and corporations more. When they talked about taxing more for stronger government, but stronger government with the private sector always in step with engaging the government, it seemed so much like exactly what was done with the pharmaceutical firms that, the top 6 vaccine makers were given $12.3 billion in subsidies. So a lot of the stuff in the Great Reset seemed to be about stronger government, not a stronger democratic government engaging in production, providing social services. It seemed to be about a stronger government taxing, yes, even the rich more, but then using those taxes to support corporate interests, much the same way that pharmaceutical firms were helped by government subsidies. So all that stuff about I forgot the terms they used. Things like the fourth industrial revolution or green infrastructure. It was all a corporate agenda being subsidized by the government, but then dressed up in all the nice words of social contract, equity, and stuff like that. But most of all, it's the World Economic Forum. So I had a very hard time actually believing any of it. How does it affect China's drive to dominate? Well, to the extent that the global economic system is a result of the policy choices made by individual governments. coming out with that kind of agenda to push for a more humane capitalism and a stronger support for corporations, actually, it seems like Western governments taking a page from the Chinese playbook of stronger government, mobilizing finance, more coordinating their private sector to strengthen themselves. So it seems to be a bit more inspired in a lot of ways by the Chinese rise. And I do agree with the question, if I picked it up right. It seemed to be a way to fix Western capitalism so that it can pull further away and not let China catch up with them through more government support for private corporations.
Sir Sunny, there's just one more from
Mhm.
Malcolm Guy. He says, you give a good picture of the role of China and US, but how are Japan and the EU, given their important investments, etc., protecting their interests in the Philippines?
Ah, um, Actually, it is true. Japan has more investments than the United States. Individual European governments have less, but taken collectively, actually the European countries, I think, have almost as much investments as Japan in the country. How are they protecting their interests? I think it's a bit different because the US and China have interests in the Philippines beyond making money from our market, our labor, and our resources. Because they're engaged in this struggle over dominance in East Asia and the Asia Pacific, where the Philippines has a key strategic location and has all the political advantages to any country that is favorable with it. I think they're on a different plane. Japan and Europe, I think, will be quite happy as long as the Philippines remains open. And the Philippines has pushed neoliberalism as far as it legally can within the constitution. And in many cases, like in mining and in water, and a lot of utilities, even beyond that. I think to the extent that Japan and the EU are just after being able to make their profits from the Philippines, I think they're not as engaged in the geopolitical struggles that and influences that the US and China are doing. I think they must feel quite protected, especially under the US orbit. And I think they're smart. I think they know exactly how weak China is vis-a-vis the US. I think despite a little bit more traction of China with the Duterte administration, they're probably smart enough to realize even though the president is the single most powerful individual in the country in Philippine governance, he's just part of a system. And I think that's a good lesson for us. No matter how much President Duterte might have wanted to get more for China for whatever selfish reasons or his cronies, there's a limit to what even the president of a powerful with that power in that position can do because he's not the state. And I think the state is very much still dominated by the US, not just in terms of a lot of the policymakers, I think even among Congress, even among the bureaucrats, and of course, even among the armed forces, and a lot of our policy intellectuals in the academe and civil society. So I think it's Duterte as a person, I think should be quite distinguished from the Duterte administration as the Philippine state.
Sir Sunny, Carol has a comment here. She says, Sunny seems like World Economic Forum is taking a leaf from China in terms of state monopoly capitalism, short of using the socialist label. Okay, you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Okay.
They're scared, and I do agree. I think they're all very worried, and maybe a lot of them bought into the globalization, free market hype. So yeah, I think they're probably very, very scared right now.
Okay.
Stakeholder capitalism. Sorry, that's the term the World Economic Forum used. They want to promote stakeholder capitalism, where workers own a bit of a bigger share of the company and shared more of its benefits. Yeah, so humane capitalism is what they want.
Thank you po. We actually have just one more question. I'm sorry, addressed to both speakers. Somebody is asking, how do you measure the current mass movement against the Duterte regime? Most of the critics say it's too weak. Anybody can answer.
Well, the mass movement is not just the legal democratic movement. The mass movement is the entire anti-imperialist movement in the Philippines, anti-feudal movement, which also includes the revolutionary forces who are also struggling against the Duterte regime. And despite the pandemic, there have been some interesting breakthroughs in terms of mass actions, despite the restrictions imposed by the Duterte regime. Of course, the mass movement is also under intense repression. It is under attack in ways that we have not experienced in the past 20 years. No? In some ways, even worse than the period of Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. And in some instances, we've seen worse types compared to the Marcos regime. So these are challenges that also require solidarity, also require support from our friends and allies. And we would like to invite everyone in advance, if it is possible, please do come to the Philippines in 2022. There's much to see here. It will be a very exciting time. There's the electoral battle, there's the mass movement, there's the whole campaign and effort, great effort and broad united front to defeat Duterte once and for all. So I think moving forward, there are indeed challenges, and we would greatly appreciate at this time the kind of solidarity and support provided by our friends and allies from the international anti-imperialist movement.
Sir Sunny, would you like to add or?
I just want to echo what one of our foreign friends told us just the other day. She said that the mass movement should actually consider the stepped up attacks against it, likely heightening in the coming period, as an affirmation of the strength of the mass movement. I know she said that to try to rally our spirits, but I do agree. If the mass movement were really weak and ineffectual, it wouldn't be under such attack. So I think if you know who you are but who your enemies are, I think that's an important backhanded compliment that the mass movement is the strongest force for change in the Philippines right now. It is facing huge challenges, but again, like Nato said, it's not just the organized forces that compromise the mass movement for change in the Philippines. President Duterte, I think, the quick implosion of his power base and his allies, and possibly his erosion of his mass support as well, I think that all goes to show that his strength is a bit overplayed. And there are people who have been convinced enough by liberal values or more progressive values, or are able to think critically, who will, I think, outlast his administration. That doesn't mean it's going to be an easy win to beat him in the elections, for instance. But I think in terms of strength, there's a significant core of strength beyond the organized forces to a lot of political forces in the country. So I think all told, it worked to inspire me. You just said that at least. I mean, it's good to hear that from an outsider who's concerned about Philippine struggles.
Maraming salamat po. We would like to apologize. Sadly, we need to wrap up. Thank you very much. Maraming salamat po to our speakers, Sir Sunny and Sir Nato, for their presentations and for answering all the questions. So for all those who still might have questions or clarifications, you may message them to the Secretariat so that they may be able to relay them to our speakers. They will also try their very best to address pressing questions through their publicity materials. So please don't forget to like their page on Facebook for updates. ILPS also has a Twitter account, so you may follow them. It's at ILPS_official. So again, thank you very much for actively participating in the program. Now we can wrap up the program by listening to the ILPS hymn.
From every corner of the world, we have come together. We are bound by a great cause for freedom, justice, and peace. Under the banner of the League, we all stand united as the struggle surges on of people against exploitation. Let us break the chain of oppression, defeat the wars of aggression. With every stride, with every fight, we shall change the world. Dare to struggle, dare to win, the torch of freedom blazing. Wave by wave, let's all march on, rage and seize the dawn. Let us break the chain of oppression, defeat the wars of aggression. With every stride, with every fight, we shall change the world. Let us break the chain of oppression, defeat the wars of aggression. With every stride, with every fight, we shall change the world. With every stride, with every fight, we shall change the world.
With this, we hope to see you at the next webinar scheduled on October 2, also at 9 p.m. Philippine time. That will be the third and last webinar in this educational webinar series, and it will feature ILPS Chair Emeritus Professor Jose Maria Sison, who will talk about the prospects of the national and social liberation movement in the Philippines, while Antonio Tuhan of Ibon, Belgium, will talk about the anti-imperialist legal democratic movement in the Philippines. Thank you very much. Maraming salamat po. And may we struggle together to end the US Duterte regime. Long live international solidarity.
Salamat sa lahat. Thank you. Thank you.